Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And today is the 54th day since the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, perpetrating a massacre that resulted in a war that is still raging to date. During that massacre, of course, there were 1,400 individuals who were brutally murdered, mostly civilians. Over 4,800 others were wounded, and over 245 were taken captive by Hamas and other terror groups, and some of them are currently being held still in captivity to date. As we continue to update you from here in Jerusalem, let's turn now to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you tell us about the latest?
So the ceasefire agreed upon between Israel and Hamas through various mediators, Egypt, Qatar, supervised by the United States and administered partly by the Red Cross, is holding. It's been the sixth day. Israel is expecting the release of another batch of 10 minors and women. It has been in the process already as we are speaking, and in Qatar, they are finalizing the next extension of the ceasefire for another several days, the exact number to be announced. Again, some 10 hostages per day of the ceasefire extended. Everyone here is waiting for Secretary of State Antony Blinken to come from the NATO summit in Brussels and other points in Europe to the region to visit Israel, the West Bank, and the UAE. All in all, not much to report. As Eric Maria Remark said, all quiet on the Western Front, or at least above ground. And the major news of the day has been in the West Bank, and not necessarily with Hamas, where the IDF, along with the Shin Bet ISA agency and the border police special unit Yamam, took care of the leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad members at the Jenin refugee camp, Muhammad Zbeidi, and one of his colleagues in a very important operation to act against the terror cells there. In the northern border, along the northern border, again, seemingly quiet. Apparently, Hezbollah too is waiting to see whether fighting resumes in Gaza, in which case it will reconsider rejoining the fight.
Thank you, Mr. Oren. I think 3 points are very important. One, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is an Iranian proxy in all the categories that you can think about, from the directives. Its leader is sitting usually in Damascus, Ziad al-Nahala, namely, and it is funded, armed, and also acts as a mediator or a mediator between the Islamic Republic and the Islamist Hamas. Another point that I think is very important to highlight, which you didn't mention, and that is that Yosh Zalka, the head of the strategic department at the foreign ministry here in Jerusalem, has also mentioned Qatar as a bad actor that should be dealt with right now, of course, because of its role as the patron of Hamas and holding its political leadership in Doha. It conducts mediation in order to, of course, also embolden its leverage over the United States in this position. But nonetheless, after all is done, the state of Israel will have to deal with Qatar in one way or another to ensure that its malign behavior, including its deep corrupt activities in both the United States, Europe, where an ongoing investigation is taking place with over 165 members of parliament being investigated and still under very close scrutiny, it will have to basically answer for all of the mayhem that it has caused throughout this period. A third point that I think is very important to highlight, and that is that it seems to be unanimous amongst Jerusalem's war cabinet that once the pause ends, the fire starts. And that is something that has been stated across the board. And therefore, I'd like to turn to Brigadier General in Reserve, Doron Gavish, the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense. Thank you for joining us, General. How are the preparations right now ongoing ahead of the resumption of fighting, whether or not it takes 2 or 3 or 4 days? The fighting will restart at some point, and the intentions are to expand the war also to the southern part of the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip.
Well, indeed, Jonathan, the IDF troops in the Gaza are prepared on the operational pause line, as we know, and basically they are prepared to carry out the next phase of the war. As you mentioned, the understanding is there that right after this pause, the IDF would go on with the fight against the Hamas. So at this time, the troops are taking the advantage of the pause to increase their readiness, to go over the plan, to coordinate even better for the next stage, and to deepen the achievements of this war, which we have to say we, in a way, just started it. So the IDF for sure is determined to return to the battlefield, and we have to remember that it have to continuously maneuver between the two main goals of this war. The one being the destruction of the Hamas as an organization in the Gaza Strip, and the other one is, of course, to bring back the hostages. And on this, we have to say that some of this goal we see with the hostages that are here in Israel, but we also remember that we have more than 150 hostages which are still on the hands of this brutal organization. So we understand that in order to bring them back, probably the only way is to continuously and press the Hamas and to bring him to a point that he would understand that this is the only way to survive. And of course, we saw it in the last few days, and we see those hostages back in Israel because of this reason that he's being pressed by the IDF.
Thank you, General Gavish. Let's also now turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, a former U.S. Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Thank you for joining us, General. I'd like to ask you particularly about a statement that was made by the Zim shipping company, in which it decided to divert much of its shipping to circumvent both the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea, particularly because of the threat emanating from Yemen by Ansar Allah, the Iranian proxy, and Houthi-based or Houthi tribe-dominated organization. What is the United States doing in order to try and mitigate this threat, considering the fact that the commercial implications for this announcement are quite vast?
Well, I agree with you, Jonathan, and I'm quite surprised that the U.S. has not taken a more active effort in this regard. There has been a maritime task force that is commanded by the U.S. and alternatively by the Egyptians every 6 months or so. It was a lightly manned task force, maritime task force, and I certainly hope that they are beefing it up right now, because the whole purpose of these maritime task forces is to do exactly what you mentioned, protect international shipping in international waters, make sure there's no economic impact on the world economy, particularly in oil prices. So it is a bit of a puzzlement to me why they haven't stepped this up yet, to the point where commercial shipping is not confident and is starting to divert as a result. So I would expect that CENTCOM, NAVCENT, Naval Forces Central Command, are working their way through this at present, because the impacts of this diversion, it will start being felt at the gas pumps and elsewhere.
Absolutely. And I'd like, if I may, also follow up, since you were the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, who set up the Anti-Piracy Task Force, or the U.S.-led Counter-Piracy Task Force, which includes a number of nations, including, of course, the United States, Britain, France, and China, for that matter. And within this context, and just several days ago, we saw a report by NavCent about a group of 5 pirates, so to speak, who later we found out to be Somali pirates who attempted to take over a commercial vessel. And within that context, there were also, after the interception and the response to the distress call, 2 ballistic missiles that were fired in the direction of the American vessel that responded to the distress call. The Houthis subsequently claimed that it had nothing to do with the American position, and that all reports coming out of America are a lie. Naturally, as this organization's logo is starts with the words "Death to America," so you wouldn't expect anything else from this group. But nonetheless, what can you tell us about that, and what is being done right now to reinforce this region once again for maritime shipping?
Well, again, there are ongoing maritime task forces operating inside the Persian Gulf right now. At one time, we even had a EU task force as well as a NATO task force. But you bring up the point, which is probably slowing down this process of assembling the maritime task force, which is we weren't taking cruise missiles from the Somali pirates back in 2009, 2010. And if you actually have a when it starts to go from piracy to active baiting of international commercial shipping with cruise missiles, or even baiting the maritime task force with cruise missiles, obviously you're going to have to construct this maritime task force in a completely different way than we've done in the past. So I would expect that's probably what's delaying the response to this, and I would certainly hope that we get on it fairly soon.
Thank you, General. Mr. Oren, I'd like to hear your point to this as well, but also let's address the elephant in the room with regard to the smuggling of weaponry from the Islamic Republic of Iran to Yemen, which has been something that has been ongoing for quite some time. NavCent has been quite instrumental in trying to disrupt the smuggling efforts. Nonetheless, we do see an increased arsenal of both ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, UAVs, and other weapons that are being currently in the possession of this Ansar Allah organization. How can the international community actually deal with such a reality at a time when it truly impacts not only a number of Western partners and allies throughout the region, but also the West itself?
Well, because you know the geography of Iran, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, you know how difficult it is to try and block all smuggling there. First of all, smuggling is an honorable art there going back thousands of years. Many of the tribes there made their living on smuggling and have no intention to stop doing so. And they are smuggling everything from appliances and cars to weapons and women. And from Iran to Yemen, across the waters, it is very easy to dismantle weapons and put them on very small boats and then assemble them again once they are in Yemen. At one time, when Iran tried to smuggle weapons through Yemen, not to Yemen, but through Yemen, to the PLO and its various offshoots, Israel managed to intercept those shipments by attacking convoys in Yemen or trying to go from Yemen to Sudan, from Sudan to the Sinai, and from the Sinai to Egypt. But smuggling is quite easy. Blocking it is difficult unless you have very precise intelligence and you know what you're looking for and where to look for it. But let me make another point, which has to do with the big power alignment. We heard that Hamas is setting free, releasing two hostages with Russian nationality, free of charge, not as part of the deal. Israel doesn't have to release from its prisons 6 prisoners for it. Hamas is making this gesture to Putin because it wants Russian protection, Russian auspices, as it sees the United States aligned so closely with Israel. It is looking for an additional patron. Iran is not enough for Hamas. It hopes that Russia will side by it too. But we know the Russians. They are cold-blooded. They have their calculations. If it will fit their interests, they will support Hamas. If not, they will throw them to the wolves of the tundra.
It's important to highlight, with regard to your letter note, that Moscow does not regard Hamas as a terrorist organization, highlighting that in 2004 it won the elections of the Legislative Council of the Palestinian Authority, something that, of course, was problematic to say the least for Israel and other nations in the West, and therefore Russia sought to counter the West by recognizing Hamas as the sole legitimate ruler of the Palestinian controlled territories, something that, of course, has not been ratified, and the history evolved since.
And this is because democracy is very important for Russia.
Of course. Let's turn now to General Gavish, since obviously we see, on the one hand, the various attempts by the Houthis to launch cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and other projectiles towards Israel's southern city of Eilat have failed time and again in light of the great cooperation, A, between Israel and Central Command of the United States, of course, and B, because of the own Israeli capabilities to intercept such projectiles from threatening Israeli territory, and therefore the Houthis at this stage are diverting to alternative means. But when we're talking about additional theaters, namely Iraq, Syria in particular, which just also held quite a robust Security Council session on various challenges presented out of this territory, how is Israel now looking at the various threats accumulating, and what are the preparations being done ahead, again, of the anticipated start of yet expanding the ground operation in Gaza?
Well, Jonathan, you are touching a very important point, because as we are all focusing on the war in the Gaza Strip, we have to say that from a strategic point of view and also from operational point of view, we are under a war which is multi-directional, multi-dimensional, different ranges, different angles, and different enemies. And this is quite complicated, of course, and it brings a lot of challenges. But we have to say that this is something that Israel prepared itself for quite a long time. Of course, when it comes to the BMD fight, we saw this multi-tier defense that was applied during this war. We saw for the first time that the Arrow was intercepting those missiles coming from the Red Sea. And this is something that is being prepared in the last 10 and even more years. So it's not that we are surprised that from what we are seeing, we were prepared to it. But of course now, when we see that the action are being taken, we have to finalize the way that we are working within the IDF, but also with our partners. And we have to say that as we said it for the Gaza Strip, also for the other threats from this multi-dimensional and multi-angle, I would say, threat, we are cooperating with our partners. We are polishing our procedures, and we are preparing ourselves for the next stage. We still have to remember that on the strategic level, Israel stated that we are in the attack on the Gaza Strip, but we are actively containing in the northern arena and other arena, but still being prepared for this war to be escalated. It's not something that we are looking for, but we are prepared for it. And we didn't talk about it for a while, but we have to remember that majority of the Israeli Air Force is prepared to inflation that, let's put it this way, that could come in this war, mainly in the northern part of Israel. There are still hundreds of thousands of Israeli troops, reserve troops mainly, that are deployed in the northern part of Israel. So no one really went to rest. We are taking this time just to polish our way of working, to go back to the plans, to make sure that when we come to this conflict, we would come even stronger.
Thank you, General Gavish. General Kimmitt, I'd like to ask you particularly about the elephant in the room, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran. It published footage from an overhead drone taking surveillance from the Dwight Eisenhower strike group and particularly also the airstrike carrier, something that obviously Navcent said was unprofessional and dangerous. Nonetheless, there is no reaction at hand. And at the same time, when we're talking about the neighboring countries and the influence exerted by the Islamic Republic of Iran, particularly also in Iraq, we see Hashd-e-Shaabi, namely the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, emboldened and deploying in different locations throughout Iraq along borders that are showing a certain intent of potentially expanding their activities to neighboring countries, something that is also raising concerns not only in Jerusalem but in Washington.
Yeah, on the latter part, I would say that the chance of the Iranian-backed proxies actually entering into the conflict, to my mind, are quite low. First of all, they are not really well equipped. Number two, every soldier that they lose inside of that conflict is a capability that they lose inside of Iraq as well. The purpose of these Hashd-e-Shaabi are primarily for control inside of Iraq and influence inside of Iraq. So I think that what we're seeing with the Hashd-e-Shaabi are primarily demonstrations more than anything else, rather than a real intent to actually come into the active battlefield. On the issue of the drone flying over the Dwight Eisenhower, I would say that Navcent expected that, not surprised by it, totally able to defend it. But like the Hashd-e-Shaabi, it just is another example of Iranian intimidation. I don't think it's a sign of Iranian intentions.
How do you see, though, the response by the U.S. right now to put Iran in its place? Because it's not only intimidations throughout the region, the force projection that it has through its proxies in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, do provide it with ample capacity to threaten U.S. partners and allies and force foreign policy to be aligned with or take into account Iranian threats, something that we're seeing also now by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Jonathan, I don't necessarily agree that they are an existential threat to the region. The proxy groups are nettlesome, they're nuisances. When you get groups like Hamas that do what they've done inside of Israel, then they become very, very existential to one country, and the same with Hezbollah, but certainly not existential to the region. It would appear to the American policymakers at this point that they want to contain Iran, but they don't necessarily want to do much more than contain. They believe that Iran is not looking for a fight, and even if that fight happens, that the capability of the Americans and their allies in the region is so overwhelming that it would be a death knell for the Iranian theocracy at the least.
Thank you, General Kimmitt. Mr. Oren?
Well, I agree with General Kimmitt. The Iranian proxies are nibbling at the margins, and it is a wise decision by Washington not to be drawn into a fight where it is not a vital interest of the United States to get there unless and until there are fatalities, and then they will have to put their muscle where their mouth was, obviously.
Yep.
However, let's talk for a minute, if we do have a minute,
You only have
about the messages coming out of Jerusalem today regarding what's next. And there are two basic messages. One has to do, and this is from Netanyahu personally and other senior spokesperson. First of all, that Israel will go back to fighting. It will resume its ground maneuver no matter what. And the other one is that if the deal suggested by the mediators is to release all Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, plus stopping the war altogether in exchange for the rest of the hostages, there's no deal. Which means that if it is only prisoners for hostages, without stopping the war, we can talk about it.
Thank you, Mr. Oren. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank General Kimmitt, General Gavish, and Mr. Oren for taking out of your times to update us on the latest. I'd like to thank all of you at home following this update. Of course, we'll have initially TV7 Israel news at 9 p.m. Jerusalem time, followed by another strategic panel where General Kimmitt will be joined also by the former chairman of NATO's military committee and the chief of general staff of the Bundeswehr, namely General Klaus Naumann, to yet another episode of Jerusalem Studio. Until then, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.
My name is Oren. I used to be Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of Israel, currently Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a think tank, and the editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. For the last few years, I've been a regular panelist for TV7, a fantastic opportunity to bring deep and analytical perspectives to the debate over regional affairs, Israeli affairs, international affairs, in the company of some of the best minds in Israel.